Hey, I'm Anfa. I'd like to show you some progress that I've done on a ubershader for Liblast. The goal of this ubershader is to allow us for making materials that can look okay, hopefully not super repeating on large surfaces, but also have some unique detail up close. For example, the first material I made, and the material I started making this shader on, is this here rocky sandy ground, which is supposed to be a surface of a planet or something. And this material consists of a couple textures. There's obviously the base material, but there is more. And I'm going to show you the main point of this material and ubershader is that you can look at this, and from this perspective, it does look like there's a unique texture. I can't really see a repeating pattern. Let me tell you if you can see a repeating pattern. And then when we zoom in to this level, we still have good detail. Actually, we could add another layer of micro detail to go even deeper, though I don't think it's necessary at this point, but it's totally feasible to do in the future. It would be very much possible. Now, this material here is a bit different. This is an atlas, a hotspot atlas that is designed for texturing various shapes, like laying out floor paneling and wall paneling and stuff. So this is by design a repeating texture. What is not repeating, or is not supposed to be perfectly repeating, is the rust, which is an overlay on top of that. And some of the textures are working to hopefully break up this repetition. You can see that this thing here isn't the same as this thing here. As this thing here, even though they are quite similar, they're not the same. And when we zoom out, yeah, you can see a bit of a pattern, like this thing is tiling, but it's never the same actually. Also, there's this more rust overall here than there is here. It's like, no, you can see some tiling, but it's not tiling every single time the same. Like, this is totally different than this in shape. Yeah, this bright color. So, you know, this material is not designed to be watched at such a large scale. It's designed to be watched at a much smaller scale. That's just, you know, a good stress test to see. So it is not looking fantastic from this distance, unlike this material, which I think is holding up excellently from this distance as well. Okay, let me show you how does this work. What does the ubershader do? Let's go maybe first to the rock material. I'm gonna save my stuff, and so what we have here is we have a base material. Here is our base color. So you can see if I clear this, we have no base color. Obviously, we do want a base color, but we have a normal map and we have an ORM-D texture. This is an ORM text, ORM, so occlusion roughness metallic texture with the alpha channel being used as a mask for macro detail. And there's also empty slots for overlay. Overlay is used in here for the rust. And there is normal map. Now, there is something called macro, here. Here's a macro texture. This is a 4-channel texture. The first 2 channels are a normal map. The third channel is a albedo modulator, so it modulates the albedo value, so it makes the albedo brighter or darker. And the last alpha channel is used as a mask for detail. It's used as a mask, and the mask is, yeah. So this is the macro texture. We could probably call this the detail texture, actually, and then use it for macro and micro detail. So we could, you know, have another one of these specifically designed to be overlaid on top of material in this very up close scale, which, you know, at this point becomes kind of fractal, but I don't think there's a need for that. Okay, let's try and strip down all the layers. Let's disable the normal macro. So now we can see the normals are gonna be tiling quite strongly. Let's disable the roughness modulation from the macro texture. Okay, roughness is now repeating over and over. Base color macro, let's disable that. Okay, at this point, this texture is just a regular texture, and you can see tiling. Well, it's not perfectly. There is more at play. You see, there is something called warp. This is a 2-channel texture which contains X and Y, or U and V coordinates that are added on top of the base UVs to distort them. I can control the amount of warp on the base material. Right, so now what we have here is what you would get from a basic, you know, basic PBR shader without a detail map. And this looks okay up close. Pretty nice. But even if you look around, you can see these, some angles you can see the repeating nature of this texture. Like, you can see there is tiling. And if you fly a bit higher, and because our players in Liblast all have jetpacks, getting to this point is not uncommon. It's going to be very easy. And also it's going to be very easy if you have any structures, any verticality in your level. You're going to see the terrain from afar and you're going to see this tiling. And this looks very 90s, which is something we don't want. But we also don't want to, use 16K textures or something, that's why I'm building this ubershader to break this repetition, but not use too much memory. Okay, so first thing we can do is use the warp to distort this texture to break the repetition. Right, so now it doesn't tile so much, but of course this is way too much. So let's back it off and do it just so it to the point where it doesn't break. Actually, this is like a finishing touch, to be honest. This is so let's keep it at 0. Okay, now we have a macro texture. We can first look at the base color. So if we apply the base color, that already gives us a lot of variation. So this is the third channel in our macro texture. And what this is doing is just, modulating the brightness. And this alone quite well breaks up the repetition. Now, there is a trick in here. The macro texture isn't as simple as it might seem, because the macro this is also a texture. So you see, there is some more things going on in the macro thing. The macro texture is sampled twice and with different scales, and also one of the copies is rotated. If I reset the scale and the rotation, Okay, let's maybe do this like... Now you can see the macro texture repeating itself. Also, there is macro warp amount. We can disable that. Now you can see the macro texture is repeating itself. But we're using a little bit of rotation. As you can see, this makes it so... Can I do this? Yep. So you can see the macro texture is sampled twice. One time is rotated, which means, and the two are averaged. So we're never really gonna get the same pattern. The next thing is one of the copies is also scaled. So this is just basic, UV manipulation, but with this we can achieve the effect that the macro texture itself is not gonna look tiled from quite far away. If we go with 64 by 64, sure, we can see that, even rotation isn't gonna save us here. Sure, we can get something out of it, but at some point this is gonna be, it's gonna be tiling visibly, but we can still warp it. Right, let me reset this to defaults, which I've defined for this thing. And yeah, this is our macro texture. So now, let's see what does it do for normals. Because as you can see, normals are unaffected, which means that, if you look to the light, you can see that normals are still quite uniform and tiling. And we can see these repeating patterns in here. Like, you can see a line forming here. So, this looks okay-ish. But we can use the normal component of the macro texture to add an extra layer of detail. And if we do it too much, you can see exactly how the macro texture looks. And because we are, again, sampling the macro texture twice and blending between it, this is not going to tile so much. And when we just blend it a little bit with the original one, it nicely gives us this large scale detail that breaks up the repetition. Now in the shading, you can see that the specular reflections are giving us some nice unique detail. Okay, and there is roughness macro. And yeah, well, it does the same thing just for roughness, which again helps us alter the appearance to break up the repetition. And of course, this is way too much. Now we have the effect of puddles, like wet spots on our texture. So that really doesn't work because we also have to modulate the base color for a wet effect. It's not designed for this specifically. Right. Finally, we have some basic parameters like, the depth of normals, which is just a multiplier for the total influence of normal maps. And we also have, well, the scale is the scale of the base texture. These values might be a little bit off because we don't really have UV coordinates right now, or reasonable UV coordinates, because this is a CSG mesh which is large. It's 128 by 128. So the UV space is basically going from here 0 to 1 and 0 to 1. So the 32 means that our base texture is repeating 32 times in here. And our macro scale means that one sample of our macro texture is repeating 2 and 0.3, and one another is 3.2 times. Right, let's move on to the steel perforated panels, the hotspot atlas. Let me just check if it's all recording properly, because I'm temporarily short of one screen. Okay, that's going to be a big file. Never mind. I can handle this. Right, let's go and take a look at this rusty panel material. Let me turn off the overlay. So overlay amount, let's go back to 0. So this is the base material. You know what? Actually, it isn't. There's still macro. Let's zero this out. Macro base color, roughness. Normals are disabled. Okay, so now this is the exact same pattern repeating over and over. Cool. I'm using the exact same warp and macro textures. I just borrowed the texture the macro texture I made for this rock material and thought, okay, let's see what will happen if I use that. And turns out it works pretty okay. So why not? Okay, in the base material, in the rock texture, we were using warp. And here we don't want to use warp because, well, this texture isn't organic. It has a very strict geometric pattern, and that's not going to work unless we're going for something very surreal. Excuse me. So no warp for us on the base material, but we can still use it on the overlay or detail, macro detail. So the first thing is we have macro. We can use the roughness to create some unique non-repeating patterns. Of course, this is a bit much. I should probably have an option to remap the roughness overall, because this is lowering the overall roughness, which is might not be desired. I probably have to add a remapping control for this. Now we have normals. You see, the normals, this is prepared for the rock texture. So these normals aren't gonna actually work because now it looks like the steel panels have all been battered around quite badly. So that's not what we're going for. But we probably can do something with the base color. So this is going to make our base color brighter or darker. So, just a little bit. And now we have steel panels that don't seem so perfectly repeating from far away. So this looks a little bit more organic. Nice. Now let's go to the overlay. The overlay is pretty much just a normal material. We have an overlay base color texture, which also has alpha, which is a mask for the entire effect. We have orm, this time no detail. So it might be, I don't know. Actually, the alpha in here acts as a mask for detail here. And there is normal. Okay, let's first go overlay scale. Let's set it to exactly the same as here, so 32. Overlay warp amount, let's turn it to 0. Overlay, right. Okay, let's turn overlay on. Cool. Now the overlay texture is the same scale as the base texture. So as you can see, every single instance repeats. From far away, this is super obviously repeating. We can do something about it. Not as much as for the rock texture, at least not yet. Maybe I'll find a way to break it up even more. So what we can do is use the overlay macro mask, which uses a mask created from our macro texture. So macro textures alpha channel sampled twice, and it kind of overlays it with the base thing, which, as you can see, creates some large-scale noisy patterns. Now at micro level, you can still see some repeating patterns. So what we can do to help this situation a little bit is use the overlay warp amount to distort the whole rust texture. Of course, this isn't too much, but we can safely distort this texture quite a lot. Because of its chaotic nature, it can really take quite a lot of distortion and still looks pretty okay. I couldn't really tell that something is wrong. What I can tell, though, is that it's not really repeating. I don't really see these, lines. And that is nice. Of course, we could maybe try and sample the overlay texture twice and blend it just like we did with the the macro texture, but that could probably not be so good because we're gonna lose the internal structure of the rust itself. So I don't think it's gonna be a good idea. We also have an alpha scissor effect with customizable threshold. For this particular material, I set it to 0.75 because if we go far away, the bitmaps are blending in and basically they're cutting off the whole thing. But if we raise the threshold a little bit, we can combat this. Now, it seems like 0.8 is like a magical threshold where the bitmaps average to nothing or to everything. And this looks broken, so I think I'm gonna go with 7.5. This looks much less broken. And up close we can see that the floor is see-through. This is fixed already in a newest version of the textures. We're using SDF technique to smooth out this alpha clip mask. But this is an earlier iteration of the texture, so it doesn't use that effect yet. Okay, I'm not going to explain how this shader works internally because it's a little bit complex. I don't have all the time now. It's not that super complicated, I think. I'm trying to make it more readable. It's a bit difficult because Godot lacks some nice tools for organizing shader graphs. So the visual shader editor is, there isn't a reroute node like a dot you'd put, and then you can make sure your lines, your connections are nicely organized. Don't go at different weird angles. Yeah, right now it's a bit difficult to make things readable. The only tool to organize things is the comment node, which is also quite limited. You can change the color of it. You can just give it a title and text, and then yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah. Also, what I don't like is that you can't it seems you can't really choose an order of how all these parameters are listed here in. So it just seems like they appear in the order that they appear in the shader text in here. So it just so happens that warp scale is on top. And yeah, I could probably, customize this somehow, but I would need to edit the text, and the whole point of, using a visual shader editor is to not deal with text, the shader text. So yeah, I know there's a pending overhaul of the visual shader editor and visual shader system in general. But that's probably going to take a while before it actually changes the way we work with visual shaders in Godot. Okay, I think that's all for now. Maybe that was inspiring or interesting. Maybe you want to play around with this. If you do, you can actually go to libla.st or code.libla.st and then clone the Git repository of the game. Check out the enviro_materials branch and you'll find exactly this thing, which I'm working on. And this is the scene called material testing. You can also run the game. Because this is an actual game level. Once you run the game, seems like it's taken a while. Actually, I don't think I've run it in this version of Godot after updating, so let's see if it works. Maybe I didn't break anything. This is fine. But it is taking a while. Oh, I have two instances. Never mind. Right, so you can just choose material testing as your level. Maybe just get rid of the bots. Host local game. And it seems things are happening. Yep. And we're here. Whoa, I clicked something. Right. You can see we can walk around. There's some shader compilation star, I don't know. As you can see with the jetpack, it's quite easy to get a bird's eye view on the whole thing. That's why developing a way to make the materials not extremely repetitive, I think, was important. Well, I got some really bad, I don't know if it's shader compilation, probably is. Yay. This textile density is pretty okay, really. Right, so like this you can test the whole thing and, walk around, see what you're doing, how does it look in game. And you can also spawn in some bots and try to wreck them. Hey, flaming bits.